our attention right now is divided among so many really important things like Ukraine, still COVID, racial and economic issues. So where do our gardens fit in right now? Actually, they're really important in a surprising number of ways. They are a respite from the chaotic and upsetting news cycle. Pulling out the weeds is satisfying, and the bees and butterflies swarming in our native plants are mesmerizing. Moreover, if we learn to garden without chemicals and teach our communities to do this too, we can make a surprisingly big difference and an important impact. Very small amounts of these chemicals can have serious long-term health consequences, and gardening without them will protect the health of our families and well-being of others in our watershed as well. Insects, amphibians, birds, and other wildlife that depend increasingly on our yards for habitat, as there's more and more development, can be hurt by these chemicals too. And not only that, but the same native plants that are easy to grow without these chemicals are the ones, and Cathy's going to talk more about this, that offer the most food and shelter to this wildlife. But the impact can actually go well beyond that. Right now, renewable energy and electric cars are causing oil and gas companies to plan for decreasing fossil fuel production. Instead, these companies are increasing the production of chemicals made from petroleum, including pesticides and fertilizers. Chemical production has doubled since 2000 and is expected to double again over the next 10 years, according to the Global Chemical Outlook published by the United Nations. Corteva, Bayer, ChemChina together now represent $50 billion worth of seed and pesticide sales annually. Bayer, Corteva, ChemChina, and BASF, all primarily chemical manufacturers, control more than 60% of the global proprietary seed sales. Clearly, much of this is for agriculture, but there's more turf than corn in the United States, and homeowners use up to 10 times more chemical per acre than farmers do. If we work together with our communities and garden without these chemicals, we can make a huge impact. This affects air quality for all of us, and disproportionately for minority communities that live near the sites of production of these chemicals. Some of the toxic emissions from pesticide production include toluene, methanol, methyl chloride, and hydrogen chloride. Some of the toxic emissions from fertilizer production include manganese, chromium, nickel, and selenium, all of which are heavy metals and pose serious health threats. And the particulate air pollution produced causes an increased risk of lung and cardiovascular disease, both of which make people more likely to have a poor outcome with COVID. These chemicals also harm the health of people who work with them, and many people employed by landscaping companies are minorities. Many of these people need the work and can't say no to their bosses if they tell them to handle these products, often without adequate protection. But homeowners can say no. These chemicals are expensive, and many landscaping companies make their profits from applying them. So homeowners have two good options. One is simply to save money, and especially now, and leave them out. And the other is to continue to support your landscape company with the same income, just redirect their energy and apply it to cultural techniques like aerating and overseeding the lawn, mulching leaves into the lawn or in piles to use on garden beds in the fall, and testing the soil if there are problem areas. Gardening without chemicals is really a two-pronged thing. One is developing the soil culture that supports plant health without chemicals. That's a matter of learning simple cultural techniques and not killing the good thing in the soil. It's really pretty easy. The other is dealing with invasive species that can easily overwhelm natives, and that's much more difficult. It's a matter of setting your priorities, persistence, and is often different from site to site. So I am passionate about water quality because I'm a mom and a doctor, and the environment is crucial to our health and well-being. When we were young, when our children were young, we had a farm in the Adirondacks, and I was under the illusion that inside the magic blue line of the Adirondacks, everything would be pristine. but people lived there, and we had a mile and a half of river, and the river was not organic. But in my town of Bedford, New York, which is closer to New York City, has denser population, but a strong environmental community, there was actually cleaner water quality. And that's where I learned the importance of a community caring for a watershed. I published the Great Healthy Yard Project in 2014 to explain the importance of household pollutants and focused on water quality because it is our largest source of exposure. Our bodies are 60% water, and it's also easy to act on. I designed this to make a measurable impact in water quality by measuring how many people are participating, by having people pledge to participate. The project explains why we need to stop using these chemicals, how they get into the water and how they hurt us, and how to garden without these chemicals. 80 million pounds of chemicals are used each year and wash with the rain into our drinking water. What we need to do is change these, treatment does not remove them, and we depend on everyone in our watershed to protect our water. New information shows that small amounts that we used to think were inconsequential actually pose serious long-term health problems. So when so many people say to me, these chemicals would not be sold if they were not safe. But when they went on the market after the people really think that. And when they went on the market after World War II, they were thought to be a miracle. You know, the pesticides helped prevent both the GIs and people in the areas that they were working, and people here from getting malaria. And the fertilizers initially provided a bump in food that helped us win World War II. Now these synthetic fertilizers have depleted the soil, and that bump in food has gone away. So after the war, these chemical companies were looking for new markets for their product, and their target market was young men coming home from the war and starting families and having gardens. And the big thing was an emerald green lawn was a sign of success. But what we need to do now is to change the aesthetic of the American yard and convince people that we can have more beautiful yards without synthetic chemicals. Legislation will take years. We can change what we are doing now. 80,000 chemicals have entered the market since World War II. Homeowners use 10 times more chemical per acre than farmers do. And there is 3 times more lawn than corn, according to NASA in the United States, more turf. And there are more of us, and it adds up. So while one bag of fertilizer or herbicide in the back of your car doesn't look so bad, even looking in your one home goods center, it starts looking pretty bad. And when you add all of that up, it's huge. Surprisingly, since the Clean Water Act, household chemicals are the most widespread threat to our drinking water. So where do these chemicals go when they go into our yards? They go onto our pets or our children. They wash with the rainwater into our streams, lakes, rivers, and are absorbed into our groundwater aquifers. And together, these are the sources of our drinking water. And tests show that, in fact, these chemicals are in our drinking water. Tests by the EPA show that 50% of the streams nationwide and 70% in our region in the Northeast and also in the Midwest have enough fertilizer to be deemed of poor quality to support life. The U.S. Geologic surveys streams and have shown that almost every stream nationwide and half of the deep groundwater wells have at least one pesticide in measurable amounts and often more. So you can be eating organic food, avoiding BPA and chemical sunscreens, but if we don't change what we are doing and putting into our water, we're exposed to even more chemicals that way. And this is really easy to change. Small amounts of these chemicals cause harm by a mechanism that was only recently understood, and they act cumulatively. In 2009, the Endocrine Society released a position paper saying that there is definitively a link between these chemicals and diseases caused by disruption of the endocrine system. And this was based on 450 peer-reviewed journal articles. This was not a hypothesis, this was proven. So bear with me, I'm a doctor, I'm gonna get geeky, but just for a second, okay? So hormones don't just get involved with sex and puberty. They control every system in our body. Neurologic development in unborn babies, growth, and metabolism. And disrupting hormones either means that these chemicals act like extra hormone, or it blocks the receptors and prevents hormone from acting. And unlike carcinogens that act by damaging DNA, endocrine disruptors cause problems that are long-lasting in very small amounts. We all know if we go out in the sun can hurt our skin and cause skin cancer if our skin can't repair the damage to our DNA that the sun causes. But most of the time, our body can repair that DNA damage. That isn't true with this. If your hormones are disrupted by these tiny amounts of chemicals, it can wreak havoc on the system. And children are the most susceptible with lifelong consequences from exposure at the wrong time, although it affects all of us. And many pesticides are endocrine disruptors. We should care because children that were born in the 70s are the first generation that were exposed straight from the womb through adulthood, and they have an increased incidence of infertility. Breast cancer now affects at least 12% of women, and prostate cancer 16% of men. And we know, and I'm going to explain this, and it's true for all the other categories I'm going to go into right now, but we know that disrupting sex hormones increases the incidence, not the sole cause of these things, but it increases the incidence because we can replicate this in animal studies, in cell culture and tissue studies, and epidemiologic studies, including body burden studies and in occupational studies. ADHD affects 10% of people in this country, autism almost 2 million people, and we know that the incidence of this, by the same sorts of studies, are increased by disrupting thyroid hormone. So we've known, does anybody know why we put iodine in salt? See, I'm old, so I do know that.
I'm that old too, to prevent thyroid.
Right, so people who didn't live on the coast and weren't eating shellfish got goiters, their thyroids needed the iodine to function, and when women had goiters when they were pregnant, the babies were born with severe diminished IQ. And that was because the thyroid hormone was out of kilter. So it should not be surprising to us that neurologic development is thrown out of kilter by things that affect thyroid hormone. 1 in 3 Americans is expected to have diabetes by 2050. And we know that the incidence of diabetes is increasing by chemicals like pesticides and herbicides that disrupt the hormones of metabolism. And we've known since the 80s that farm workers that work with these chemicals have a much higher amount of diabetes. I had an article in the New York Times in 2014 when the government was proposing changes to protect agricultural workers from the same chemicals that we use in our yards and gardens, because the EPA acknowledged that these chemicals cause diabetes, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, Parkinson's disease, and lung cancer. And we know that they're not the only cause, but they do cause a significant increase. So my article basically said we should not be decorating with these chemicals. On September 28th, 2015, the EPA announced the improved worker protection standards for farm workers that I was talking about then, and they were not enacted until 2018, but they were enacted then. And later, the same day that they were, in 2015, that they were announced that they were going to be eventually enacted, the Endocrine Society released ED2, a second scientific position paper, and those are really rare from these international groups of scientists and doctors and researchers in hormones. And they said that herbicides and pesticides are endocrine disrupting chemicals, and we must start minimizing our exposure now. And the evidence, as I said, came from animal tissue, cell culture, and epidemiology. This set the stage for the World Health Organization in March 2015, who then designated glyphosate, which is usually marketed as Roundup, as a probable carcinogen, and 2,4-D, which is dicamba, as a possible carcinogen. Bird and insect populations throughout the globe are crashing due to pesticides, habitat encroachment, and climate change. 68 bird species have lost more than 50% of their populations between 1970 and 2014, and 20 have lost 75%, according to Partners in Flight. There's also been more than a 75% decline in flying insects in just the past 27 years. It's not just herbicides and pesticides, but also fertilizers that hurt waterways and health. Fertilizers, as most of you know, fuel algae overgrowth, and blue-green algae suffocates fish and harms ecosystems. Blue-green algae, however, is also an endocrine-disrupting chemical, and NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, University of Tennessee, did studies that found eggs in male fish in Lake Erie when they were exposed to this algae. I had an article in the Cleveland Plain Dealer in 2014 saying that these chemicals, disrupt our hormones too and are dangerous. It turns out that that article was 3 weeks before the city of Toledo had closed their water down for 3 days, which is to me just astonishing because of blue-green algae. And this problem is getting worse in the Great Lakes with climate change because it's warmer and the algae is proliferating, but it's ubiquitous. So this is a picture of the Musket Reservoir in my hometown of Katona, where there is blue-green algae. And I had an article in the Journal News about that, and the New York City DEP initially did not, but then did acknowledge that there is blue-green algae there. Blue-green algae also increases the risk of neurologic disorders. There's an increased incidence of ALS in people who live near large lakes with large amounts of blue-green algae when they are younger. Dartmouth did a paper and published that, and they said that people that grew up near Lake Muskoma actually had a 25-fold, not 25%, 25-fold higher incidence of ALS because of exposure to blue-green algae. There's a protein called BMAA found in blue-green algae that's found in higher concentrations in people with Alzheimer's disease. We don't want to be putting these chemicals into our water and into our bodies, and if we put them in our yards, that's where they will wind up. So what do? The solution is simple. If we don't use them in our yards, they won't be in our drinking water. We share our watersheds, so we have to work with our neighbors. And here's the basics of how you support your plants without chemicals. Create beds with excellent soil for these plants. This is the most crucial step because healthy plants without chemicals depend on a healthy soil culture with good bacteria and fungi to protect against bad. And to do that, you can test the soil, get a report about what's needed, and decide how to amend. One option is a nursery mix from an organic farm that would replete the nutrients you're missing. This also adds structure and carbon, and organic farmers know their material and can help you. The other is just, if you're not going to test, the reality is that a good nursery mix or compost gives you all of that and has a very diverse profile. It has micronutrients as well as macronutrients, and it's really helpful. Till down 1.5 feet, because that's how far the roots need to go. And if it's looser and aerated, the roots and the good bacteria and fungi will have air and be able to thrive. Synthetics, pesticides, and fertilizers are biocides and kill the good soil organisms and weaken our soil. Right now, don't manipulate your soil when it's wet. It destroys the structure and tilt of the soil and will wipe out any oxygen that's getting down there. Soil bacteria provide carbon that plants need. Some can also can also convert nitrogen from the air to a form that the plants can use to grow. The plants return this favor by feeding the soil bacteria carbohydrates that they derive from photosynthesis. Soil rich in decomposed organic matter and bacteria can also store water, preventing both flooding and helping plants survive in drought. Healthy soil can actually store up to 16,500 gallons per acre for each 1% increase in carbon. So it's particularly important to our watershed. To nurture the soil, aerate. This gives the roots room to grow and soil bacteria air. Use cover crops. Never leave the soil naked. That prevents erosion, and it also it feeds the bacteria that you need in the soil. And consider putting legumes in some areas when you can, because they are what encourage the bacteria that fix nitrogen. Compost. It's compost. It adds structure and micro and macronutrients. And leaf mulch is what we use on all of our beds. It is a wonderful way to either mulch the leaves into your soil to add, the nutrients that it needs and prevent the soil from drying out. But also, if you mulch your garden beds with it, it doesn't cost you anything. It has lots of bacteria and fungi on it, and it really protects your gardens. Okay, so as gardeners, there are occasionally times when you need something, particularly in vegetable gardens. So pesticides. I use actually mostly biologics at this point. I use green lacewings and ladybugs. Occasionally I use nematodes. Some people use milky spore. Some people say it doesn't work for Japanese beetles. I've had luck with it, but everybody, has to see. We had chickens for a long time. They did a really good job on getting rid of some of the bad bugs. Consider removing a problem plant somewhere or moving it where it will be happier. It's not getting a lot of sun and it gets, mildew on the leaves or other problems. Put it where it's sunny. If it just doesn't like if you have it in its perfect habitat and it's not happy there, consider putting something else there. Sometimes gardening is just like that. If you need to, you can use some certified organic treatments. Generally, I recommend only using them by hand in a small area when you can see them, because they will kill good bugs as well as bad bugs. So horticultural soap kills soft-bodied bugs like spider mites or aphids. Aphids you often don't have to worry about, but I had an aphid infestation. I was busy with other plantings. I had thrown out my lacewings and actually just ignored it, figuring the lacewings would take care of it. It did not, and they really, I had well over 1,000 Asclepias plants, milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, and they just destroyed it because the aphids secrete a honeydew, which is sweet, and then spotty mold gets on the honeydew, and that just wiped out the plants. So I have some annual seed in there now. It's a native annual bellflower, and I'm growing more milkweed to put in. But my plant advisor from my landscape architectural firm said, leave it a year. Do not put them, they're laying in wait. So keep an eye on it. There are times where a little bit of chemical in a really localized manner will save you from mass devastation, and then it's worth it. Herbicides, again, I usually, so the other things are neem oil, which is from the African neem tree. It's a insect repellent, and it's also an oil, so it's a pre-emergent. And Spinosad. Spinosad is the product of fermentation of bacteria Espinosa, but it kills everything. I occasionally, this year I'm not growing brassica plants in my vegetable garden. On the broccoli and sometimes the kale, and it depends what type of kale in my garden anyway. And on the Brussels sprouts, I get these tiny little worms with little light green stripes down the back, and I'd have to spray them with Spinosad and then come back and do that a week later. And again, literally with a hand thing, because I'm watching what I'm doing and trying not to kill other bugs. And usually doing it once and coming back a week later gets me through the season. But I really prefer when I can just using the lacewings. Herbicides, mechanical removal should be your first go-to. This is a Fisker weeder. You can stand on it and pull things out. Vinegar, citrus oil, and or clove oil mixed together, smothering with a tar or weed torch are mechanical ways of removing weeds, and it depends on where you're doing it. And Cathy asked me to speak to ticks and mosquitoes. For mosquitoes, you can use BTI, which is Bacillus thuringiensis rhodensis. It comes in little discs or things you can throw out. If you have water where you know that they are multiplying that you can't get rid of, but you can get rid of a lot of mosquitoes by not leaving anything around to collect water. And really it only takes like a soda cap full for mosquitoes to multiply. So leave your kids' pails turned upside down or bring them in. Don't leave wheelbarrows where they can collect water. You can rim, leave them under something or turned upside down if they can't collect like that. It makes a really big difference. If you have a water body and you have fish in it, that's incredibly helpful. For ticks, there's no evidence. You see these signs of people spraying for ticks. There's no evidence that spraying for ticks decreases Lyme disease. The CDC actually did a study. It decreases the amount of ticks by, I think, 60%. But zero decrease in Lyme disease. And so the Carey Institute is working with mycorrhizal fungi and fipronil. Fipronil is a pesticide, but they're working on that in boxes where the mice rub on it. So it's very localized, and that study isn't out yet, but everybody's hoping that will be a really sustainable way to make a huge decrease. So we're keeping that in mind and hopeful, but the cedar oil has never been shown to do anything. It's selling you something. My husband loves, this is not my husband, but my husband loves using the weed torch when we need it. And we've had great results with suffocating things. So I'm hoping everybody will go to the website, tghyp.com or thegreathealthyyardproject.com and take the pledge. The pledge is just to take care of your yard without synthetic pesticides, weed killers, or fertilizers, except on rare occasions in a very localized manner to resolve an infestation or improve habitat. So like if there's barberry that you can't remove, to cut it back and paint the tip. So that you can give your native plants that you put in to replace it a leg up. The invasives bloom much earlier in the spring and tend to knock out all the native plants if you're not fastidious about getting rid of them. And also we ask people not to dispose of pharmaceuticals down the drain. The police all have drug take-backs, a lot of the pharmacies do now, and that's the other major cause of pollution in our drinking waters. So, thank you. And now it is Cathy.
Just switching computers. Wanted to mention something that Diane brought up. So how many of you have heard of the Carey Institute? A couple, two people? Okay. So the Carey Institute is up in Dutchess County, New York, and they are a scientific research organization that researches things like not necessarily going to the rainforest, the stuff you see in the David Attenborough documentaries, but they're actually studying the land and the soil and the forests around here. How do we handle porcelain berry? How do we figure out what to do about Lyme disease, stuff like that. So it is a well-established and well-funded and very impressive when you look at the stuff they've been doing organization. I just encourage you to look up that. I'll put a little note about that up there, everybody. That's just called the Carey Institute up in Cary. So you can look that up. Cary Institute.
Yeah, they have amazing researchers,
Yeah.
like the level that you don't usually see outside of university.
Good, that worked out, thank you.
Are you all set? Oh, great.
Just tech support. My name is Cathy Ludden, and I don't know if I would call myself an expert so much as probably a know-it-all. But there's a fine line, and it has more to do with attitude, I suppose. But I have been I'm actually a retired Wall Street lawyer, but I retired about maybe 18, 19 years ago, and I was gardening at the time the way a lot of us do when we're new to gardening, which is I would walk around the nursery and I would go, ooh, what's that? I'll take 2 or 3 of those. And so my yard was just this mix of things that I thought looked cool. I didn't really know anything about plants. So I started doing that, and I thought, a pretty beautiful yard. And then one day, I walked out on a gorgeous spring morning, cup of coffee, and I looked up at this tree that actually had been planted on our property before we bought the house. It's a Kwanzan cherry tree. It's a Japanese cherry. Beautiful, beautiful tree. In Japan, I'm sure it is very supportive of all the local creatures that live there. But here, I walked out in the morning, I looked up at this tree, and then I got closer to it, and it has these gorgeous double blossoms. And I stood there, and suddenly it hit me that there was something just wrong. There was something missing. There was not one living thing buzzing around that tree. The leaves were perfect. They didn't have any bites out of them, no little chomps on them. There wasn't a bee, a butterfly, a bird. There was nothing. This tree is gorgeous, but as far as anybody but me was concerned, it might as well have been a plastic plant. I walked around to the other side of my house where I have a crabapple. And I came up to that tree, and I just was so immediately clear what was wrong with the cherry. This tree was literally buzzing as I walked up to it. And while I sat there, I must have seen 10, 12 different species of bees going into these flowers that are loaded with pollen and nectar. There were butterflies there. There were birds hopping around, and there were chomps and holes in the leaves because something was eating them. And I realized that this was my aha moment of what I had actually learned from this guy sometime before. And if you don't have this book, if you haven't read it, I really urge you to do it. If not for the science in it, for the plant lists. At the back of this book is native plants, trees, shrubs, ferns, grasses for every region of the US, and plants for shade, plants for sun, all of that stuff. But Doug Talmy is a professor of entomology, I think at the University of Maryland. So he's spent his whole life studying bugs. And he, as a bug person, realized that if you wanted to find particular bugs, you had to find the plants that those bugs need. And so when I heard this guy talk, it was at a garden club program, I heard him talk, and he made a connection, and I just think, how did I not know this? How did I get through high school without anybody ever saying this before? Because this is something we should all know about the relationship between plants and insects. Plants and insects co-evolved over millions of years in each region of the world. So there's a different evolutionary history in Asia, in Europe, in South Africa, in the US, and these plants and insects evolved. And 90% of all insects are plant eaters. They're phytophagists. Insects eat plants. The plants, if they're not going to go extinct, have to evolve defenses against the insects. So plants do. They come up with something toxic in their leaves that's disgusting to insects, or spiny little hairs that sting, or a gummy sap that stick their mandibles together, something that puts off the insects. And then the insects, if they're not going to starve, have to evolve to overcome those defenses. And the example that I think we all probably know the best is milkweed. We all know that there are no monarch butterflies if there's not milkweed, because monarch caterpillars have to eat milkweed. The truth is 90% of all insects are specialists like that. Every 90%, the vast majority of incidents of insects are related to a very small number of genera of plants. So in Europe, European insects eat European plants, and in America, American insects eat American plants. So if we don't plant those plants, and we only put non-native plants in our yards, the insects don't have anything to eat. And that is a real problem, which the New York Times, you can't read this print here, but they call this the insect apocalypse. And they say, what happens to planet Earth when all the insects are gone? And in fact, as you just heard a second ago, something like 70% of all of the flying insects have declined, a 70% decline over the last 26 years, something like that.
Even more over 27 years.
Yeah, and places where they have studied. This is the thing people talk about when you drive your car. Those of us who are old enough to remember this, you didn't have to drive very far before you had to wash your windshield because it was all covered with bugs. You don't anymore because they aren't there anymore. So we're suffering a huge decline in insects worldwide. And what's wrong with that? Most of us go, oh, that's okay. I don't really like insects all that much anyway. If there aren't insects in my yard, squiggly, yucky things, I don't want my kids being bitten by whatever is there. Well, you might not like insects, but how do you feel about birds? And most of our birds, the babies must eat insects. They don't eat seeds or berries. They eat insects. Okay, baby eagles, baby hawks, maybe eat a little shredded squirrel, but most of our birds eat insects. And if there aren't insects to feed baby birds, bird populations decline, and they do. So, as we just heard, pesticide is taking a terrible toll, both on insect populations and bird populations, but so is starvation. Literally, they can't find anything to eat. And that becomes another problem for us because we depend on insects. The UN said that 84% of all food crops worldwide require insect pollination to reach their maximum productivity. Without insects, it's not just the baby birds who don't eat, we don't eat. So you already know that honeybees are critical for crop pollination. And so, for example, in the apple orchards in New York, they bring in honeybees, which are not native to the United States, they're native to Europe. But they're easily handled, and colonists brought them in a couple hundred years ago. And because you can move them around, you can move the hives around. So they bring hives into an apple orchard, they release the bees go around and gather, they come back to the hive at night, and the guy who runs the bee pollination program takes them somewhere else. You've probably heard about colony collapse disorder, probably pesticide, maybe a mite, we're not sure, but honeybee populations have been severely hit. Worse than that, though, is our native bee population. There are 4,000 species of native bees in the US, 400 some in New York, and they depend, most of them, on native plants. In fact, the specialization by insects that I talked about a second ago, there are 22 species of native bees that can only eat the pollen of goldenrod. They don't even hatch until goldenrod starts to bloom. So although most bees and honeybees can take nectar from almost any flower and pollen from almost any flower, a lot of bees can't. Bees are specialists, and some of them can only eat a specific species plant pollen. So all of this means if we don't have a landscape that supports these insects, they're losing, and they really are losing because most of our landscapes look like this. This is my morning dog walk, takes me past this property, and I look at it and I just go, there is nothing to eat and there is nowhere to hide. Lawn not only is the biggest user of pesticides and chemical fertilizers, which you just heard are really bad for us, it's a non-native crop. And right now in the United States, another way to think about this is that we have 40-some million acres of national parks. We have 22 million acres of lawn. So if we just took half of the lawn in the US, if we stopped putting fertilizer and pesticide on all of it, and just took half of it and started devoting that to native plants, we could make a huge impact on land use in the United States and start saving some of these species. So what do we talk about? What do we mean when we say native plants? Those are the plants that were here before European colonists arrived. European colonists right away started bringing in plants they knew, the grains, the flowers, the bees from Europe. And those things started becoming the plants in the US. And the phrase is, we now have lots of introduced species that have been brought in from other parts of the world that are now very common here. So how do you know what's what? I mean, the question I'm asked most often as a native plant enthusiast is, well, how do I know whether something's native? Well, the first and the most obvious clue is, what's it called? Ooh, Norway maple. Japanese maple. No, not native. English ivy. Korean dogwood. Beautiful tree. It is not native to the US. So the names tell you something. The Latin names tell you even more. When I'm looking for a plant, if it says something virginiana, or something caroliniana, or something canadensis, and those are the ones I'm going to look at because those are probably native to our region, at least, northeastern United States. If it says sinensis, that means it's from China. If it says japonica, it's from Japan. There are lots of them, different ones that I can't even remember, from Africa, all the European ones. And so, what I do most often, if I'm trying to decide if I should plant something, I go to my trusty phone and I put in the name of the plant and the word native, and bam, right away it comes up. So Montauk Daisy, it sounds like it should be native, right? Yes. Long Island? Look at it. Where's Montauk Daisy from? Its real name is Nipponanthemum nipponicum. That does not sound like Long Island. So when you look at a plant in the nursery and you see the name of what it is, it's beautiful grasses, Miscanthus sinensis, that's from China. And what happens when you bring some of these plants in to our ecosystem? We know our bugs can't eat them. So they run out of control very often. Because nothing eats them, they become invasive. Now the plants that we know, like lilacs and roses that we were talking about earlier, that stay where you put them, nothing is eating them. They're not good native plants, but they also don't run amok. The plants that are very successful at spreading themselves around and propagating themselves, that have no biological controls here because nothing eats them, those become invasive plants. So back here a minute ago, I showed you one of my arch enemies, widely sold everywhere, English ivy. It's not native here. And I walked through forests in England and Ireland. The ivy doesn't do this. It stays on the ground. There's something there that eats it. But here, nothing eats it, and it'll pull down trees, it kills them. I wrote a blog post a couple of weeks ago called Evil Ivy Over Everything. So if you want to know whether a plant is native, you can find that out easily enough. So if your neighborhood looks like this, or you don't have to have your land yourself, a school where your kids go, the common area of an apartment building, a park or a hospital or someplace, community groups can start to alter that landscape. But I can tell you, this is one of my neighbors, and that lawn is perfect. It's covered with pesticide, it's covered with herbicide, it never gets a single flower, piece of clover, dandelion, nothing. And there's a soccer net back there, but I've never seen kids playing on this lawn, which is probably a good thing since all those chemicals are on the lawn. But it's not doing anything. It's just occupying space. So the first thing and the most valuable thing that I would do with that land is plant oak trees. Because our friend Doug Tallamy points out, oaks have been here a long time, our native oak trees. So that's pin oak, red oak, white oak, bur oak, scarlet oak, a lot of our American oak trees. They've been here on this continent for a very long time. A lot of insects have co-evolved with them. So quite a few insects have figured out how to live on oak trees. There are 524 species of just butterflies and moths, Lepidoptera, so caterpillars that grow on oak trees. And yet, I have 5 of them on my property, and I've never seen any of them defoliated, but they are literally caterpillar factories. So birds who are looking for soft, squishy, high-protein morsels to feed their babies, they hang out around oak trees because it's a caterpillar factory. So from the first of spring till the end of fall, your oak trees are generating life. In addition to 534 species of Lepidoptera, there are well over 1,000 other insects who must live part of their lives on oak trees. So it's the single most valuable thing you can do for local ecology is plant or save an oak tree. So when somebody's saying, let's take that oak down because it might fall on the house, it's like, not so fast. Let's just trim the branches there. Let's check it for health. If it's strong, let's try to keep that oak tree alive as long as possible because it is incredibly valuable for the ecosystem. Birch trees are very good. This is river birch. Look at all those little peely cracks and crevices. River birch are a buffet for woodpeckers all winter long because all of the bugs that go dormant for the winter hang out in all of those crevices and the woodpeckers manage to find them. So if you have, this is river birch, if you have a river birch, you will have woodpeckers. Our native red maple is a really good host plant. 300 some species of caterpillars live on red maples. White pine, this surprises you, but caterpillars live on white pine. A couple dozen species of caterpillars mature on white pine. So it's essential as a habitat. And if you want birds on your property, there's not something else you have to do. That vast array of lawn, not only does it not provide any food for birds, it doesn't provide any shelter. If you want to see birds, you need to have thickets. You need to have a lot of plants and put them close to the house so you can have the fun of watching cedar waxwing in the wintertime. If you've got a cedar tree and you can see the branches of it from your house, you're going to see these guys at some point because they move through, they look for the berries, and this is where they hunt. If you don't have a cedar, if nobody around you has a cedar, those birds don't stop here, and their populations are declining. So birds that used to be common, the eastern bluebird used to be as common as robins, and they're, we go through all kinds of special efforts now with bluebird houses to try to restore the population of bluebirds, not blue jays. They take care of themselves somehow. Bluebirds are hard to find. So you need to plant a lot of stuff, and you should have layers. The first thing you do is plant trees, then you plant shrubs, then you plant perennials, and you plant as much as you can, and just get rid of that lawn. You don't really need it. If you've got a soccer team who lives at your house, or you host an annual croquet tournament, maybe, but other than that, just leave the lawn that you actually really use. A lot of us just think it looks great as sort of the paths between the trees and the shrubs and the flower beds. So where can you see some of this stuff? I'm on the board of the Greenberg Nature Center, and it's my personal passion project. So it's 33 acres, right on the Scarsdale-Hartsdale boundary, if you know it, off of Central Avenue, Dromore Road. Great place for everybody, for kids, but for gardeners and for people who want to learn something about native plants. We've been making a lot of changes there. And one of the ones that I wanted to do is to make it kind of an example of how you can landscape around a house, which our manor house is just a house, how you can landscape around a house in a way that is attractive, that's not going to set the homeowner's authority or the local municipality on your case for having a messy, wild, native yard, but is beautiful and will host lots and lots of life. So this is a staircase garden we planted at the Nature Center. It's 100% native. We have an amelanchier, which is a shad bush up there. This is red twig dogwood. There are native evergreens on the other side surrounding the patio. And then these are all native perennials that attract lots and lots of pollinators. Around the foundation of the manor house, we can find native perennials, grasses, and little evergreens that also fill in beautifully. So if you want to see what this looks like, do come visit the Nature Center this spring. My project this year is going to be starting to put plant tags on everything so people know what's what. This is a rock outcropping next to that staircase. I get very frustrated seeing all of the non-native grasses, ornamental grasses. This natural look has become very popular, and brilliant landscape designers from Europe started this natural-looking garden style and use a lot of native grasses. If you've walked along the High Line in New York City, you've seen a lot of grasses. And they use Miscanthus sinensis and Pennisetum and all kinds of Carl Forester, all kinds of grasses that come from other parts of the world. And grasses make all these seeds and they throw themselves everywhere. So we are starting to see huge invasive crops of non-native grasses. And why? We have a native grass that will do absolutely anything those grasses do, just as well or better. So this is switchgrass. We have back at this little grass is prairie dropseed. There's little blue stem over here. This is little blue stem, and this one, upright bluegrass. It's beautiful. It's a great garden grass, and there's absolutely no reason to use non-native grasses. Ground covers. The only ground covers you see in Westchester County are Pachysandra, ivy, and vinca. What's vinca? And that doesn't make sense. Nothing eats any of those three plants. So they grow up trees, they go through forests, they infest forest land, and they're absolutely running amok. Look at this beautiful ground cover here. This stuff is called Pachara, golden ground cell. Not only does it cover the ground like Pachysandra, it does that in the spring. Why isn't that better? Why doesn't everybody do that? It's called Pachara, P-A-C-K-E-R-A. The common name is golden ground cell. And unless you started paying attention to native plants, you'd never see it because nobody plants it here for reasons I don't get. It's an aggressive spreader, but it also pulls up easier if it's going easily, if it's going somewhere you don't want it. And it is semi-evergreen. You don't have to do anything to it during the year. It needs no fertilizer. It will grow in part shade or in sun. Fabulous plant. Maybe you've heard about the pollinator pathway movement. This is a way for everybody to get more involved with native plants. And if you want to know more about it, go to this website, pollinator-pathway.org. And there's every resource you could want. It tells you how to prepare soil, tells you what plants you can put in, it tells you what the various plants are the host to, butterflies or bees or whatever. And this is an idea that's catching on everywhere. So in my community, we have pollinator pathway gardens popping up in Hastings and Dobbs Ferry and Ardsley and just all the little communities. You get garden clubs or local community groups planting pollinator gardens. And why wouldn't you? They're just beautiful. And any place grass grows, any place you have lawn, you can grow a pollinator garden. By and large, they want sun. They don't need any soil improvement because most of these are meadow or prairie plants that really, so if you start to plant a pollinator garden, you get rid of the lawn and you can either smother it or you can dig it up, cut it with a sod cut or whatever. So you get down to bare soil and then you start planting these prairie or meadow plants. So in this is beside my driveway. It's a small patch, but it rocks with color and animals. So that is Amsonia tabernamontana, blue star. That's Helenium autumnale, or sneezeweed, which is a terrible name I'll never get. And Coreopsis, which is those little daisy-like things. And then all the rest of that is milkweed, the species milkweed, and this one's called hello yellow. Flowers all summer long.
Are these your flowers?
Hmm?
This is not your.
Yeah, this is right beside my driveway.
It's
It's
so
just
beautiful.
pavement. Isn't it pretty?
Gorgeous.
I mean, who can argue with that, right? It's gorgeous. and I was walking my dog, and somebody said, "Where do you live?" And I said, "Oh, back there." And she said, "Is that the house with the butterflies?" So it really truly is. Now my sister, she had a big yard, She lived in Minnesota, rural. She had them come in and do a seeded meadow. I could only wish. So pollinator gardens can be huge, can be a meadow like this, can be tiny. This is another little patch on my yard. It's like a little bit of lawn, little patch of native flowers. That happens to be penstemon digitalis there. Pollinator gardens can be kind of, before you fuss too much trying to write these down, I have a list of plants for you at the end. So, pollinator gardens can be kind of loose and wild looking like that, or they can be very formal, very tidy. Anything that has a neat edge and a little strip of lawn next to it makes people know it's intentional, it's not just a weed patch. So when some of these things stop blooming and they just are hanging out there in the fall, and I leave them up all winter long because little things have formed cocoons and laid eggs on the leaves, so you leave all of that stuff standing all winter. And it can look kind of dry and kind of messy and sort of a little weird to some people, but if you have a nice tidy edge to it, they go, well, I'm not sure why she's doing that, but it looks okay. And so then you wait, and once the weather gets warm in the spring and all those little guys hatch, then you cut it all back to the ground and wait for things to start over again. These pollinator gardens can be in wet patches. This is a rain garden where water has been directed from one place where it normally would just shoot down to the rain gutters, to the storm drains, has been diverted into a circular bed that we dug out. We lined it with gravel, dug it out maybe 3 feet deep, lined it with gravel, put some topsoil on top. So the idea is that the water comes shooting into that, it fills up that bed, and then it gradually drains out over the next few days. And there are plants that love that, like these. So that's Joe Pye weed in the back, the white one is white turtlehead, the brilliant cardinal flower. And those are all plants that they can live in standing water for a few days. It eventually drips out, drains out, and then they're drought tolerant after that, which I still don't understand. But that's meadows for you. They get wet, they dry, and some of these plants are evolved for that circumstance. So communities are doing this everywhere. This is a little patch along the Croton Aqueduct, and this young man, community guy, and some friends decided, let's put in a pollinator garden there. So it was all weeds. They dug out all the weeds, they yanked ivy off the wall, and then they got contributions of native plants, and I helped them lay them out. We just cleared the dirt, and you plant this stuff directly into the dirt, and 2 months later there were butterflies all over them. I'm not kidding, it was beautiful. At the Greenberg Nature Center, we've had a local garden club, the Garden Club of Irvington, decided to do a small pollinator garden. So this was one of my friends from the garden club, Ann Myers, and the two of us and one guy planted this little strip over, a few hours. And then the next year, we all decided, we can do much more than that. So we planted a much bigger one. Probably this pollinator garden at the Greenberg Nature Center is maybe about half the width of this room and not quite as long, but it's bigger. And we planted it in June of last summer, and this is how it looked in July. It came up, and we used container plants, like 1 gallon containers, put them in, but pollinator gardens is such instant gratification. Put the plants in, water them in well to begin with, I plant them soaking wet, fill the container with water and let it drain out so the roots are soaking when you plant them. And then you put them into what is really a dry area. You keep an eye on them for the first season just to make sure that they don't get completely baked if you have a long dry spell. And we weeded them once every couple of weeks during the first season, but it took off like crazy. And really by July of last summer, it was just butterfly madness. The other thing to see at the Nature Center is our meadow. About 7 or 8 years ago, I led an initiative to do a native wildflower meadow at the Nature Center. So we have this butterfly arbor that we drape with netting for our live butterfly exhibit in the summer, but otherwise we take it down and it's just sort of a focal point of the meadow. And then this entire thing was planted from seed. And this meadow is now about 7 years old, and it's just, honestly, it's just beautiful. And every day it's different. It changes through the season. This picture was taken in late August, but it's just a little marvel. So if you want to know more about this stuff, I have a plant list for you here that are suggested native plants for a pollinator garden. Please feel free to take that. I have this little booklet that I wrote some time ago called Plant This, Not That. And it's kind of like the what not to wear, what not to plant. So I have my pet peeves here. So here's a picture of Miscanthus sinensis, and I say, don't plant that, plant switchgrass. And a picture of Japanese honeysuckle. No, don't plant that, plant our native Lonicera vine. So if you want to take one of those, please feel free. And then I write a weekly blog for the Greenberg Nature Center where I go on about this stuff. It's never more than 3 to 4 minutes to read, loaded with pictures. This is this week's post, which is on milkweed, with all of the different insects that specialize on milkweed, not just monarchs. And you can find that on the Greenberg Nature Center's website.
Could you leave that list and write that down?
So yes, if you go onto the Nature Center's website, you'll see the masthead for Around the Grounds blog. Click on that. The prior posts are all available there. You can sign up to get a weekly notice of it. I'm also on Instagram under my real name, which might not have been a great idea, but so far it's okay. And I post a lot of stuff about native plants. I also put the link to the blog up on Instagram every week if you prefer to go that way. So any questions you have about native plants? A lot of stuff to see at the Greenberg Nature Center to get some ideas for this stuff. Just to finish my advertising, sorry Mark.
Sure.
On April 30th, the Native Plant Center, I'm on the steering committee of that organization, has their annual native plant sale at Westchester Community College. April 30th, if you're a member, you get in at 9. If you're a non-member, the door doesn't open until 10. But we have several thousand native plants available for sale there. And all of us walking around helping people, answering questions and making suggestions for where plants should go and that kind of thing. So that's April 30th at Westchester Community College. A week after that, my garden club, which now is working with the Greenberg Nature Center, is having their pre-Mother's Day plant sale. So that's on May 7th, the Saturday before Mother's Day. And we will have some native plants there for sale, as well as some hothouse annuals that we propagate over the winter, and some perennials that we dig from our own gardens. So if you're looking for native plants, those are good ways to go. And one thing I can promise you about those, they're propagated without any chemicals. We would never, ever, ever put pesticide or chemical fertilizer in plants that we know are going out to attract these butterflies and birds.
Where's the May 10th event? The May 7th?
May 7th event is at the Greenberg Nature Center.
There's 2 other suggestions for everyone, for lists. The Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center, which my organization's an affiliate, has at wildflower.org, you can put in where you live, you can put in wet, dry, sun, shade, you can put in perennial, tree, shrub. You'll get out a list with pictures of what only native plants that grow in your area, and you can go through those and say, oh, I love this, or oh, this is not quite my cup of tea. So it gives you a really wonderful way to search. And the other thing is Audubon has Audubon Native Plants website, which will tie in which birds are attracted by which plants. So Echinacea will bring you lots and lots of goldfinches, and it'll help you figure out, I really want to see this and I'm not seeing it. What can I plant where it'll track that into my yard? So it's really fun.
Great resources. In fact,
Wildflower.org?
Yep.
Yeah,
So
that-
Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center is affiliated with the University of Texas in Austin, but it's national. And they really pioneered this. It's interesting. Ladybird Johnson was at the forefront of this with her beautification project.
She was. She was a
and-
real pioneer.
And she really said that people behave differently when things are beautiful, and I think that's really
Yes.
true. And she was headed towards it, not because of what Cathy was talking about, because she didn't understand yet that balance of insects and plants, but just our horticultural heritage, and all of those things are really tied in. So it works out really well. They've done a lot of work in Texas planting bluebonnets along the highways. Hopefully New York will do more and more with native plants along our highway strips and railroads.
And I don't know if you know this, but the Native Plant Center at Westchester Community College was the
It's
first
also, yes, I do
affiliate
know that.
of the
because-
Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center.
Yeah.
And it's, as you say, when I first heard about native plants, I thought it was sort of like the heritage side. I thought it was like, landmark buildings or, preserving historical sites. I did not understand the relationship to ecology and to the survival of nature until I heard Diane Lewis speak. And that for me was this huge aha moment. But both are great reasons to plant native plants. One other plug, there's another great book on Pollinator Gardens. This is quite new by Kim Eierman, who's on the steering committee of the Native Plant Center with me. And this is a real how-to. She tells you how to prepare the ground, what insects are going to be attracted to which thing, and she has lots of great plant lists as well. And Doug's book, of course, has the best plant list. So.
Yeah, and also keep in mind the Great Healthy
Yes.
Yard Project. And the thing about what I do is talk about why native plants are important, because you don't need chemicals with them, and not using the chemicals is crucial to the health and well-being of our soil, our pets, and our wildlife, and our families. So we partnered with, the Great Healthy Yard Project has partnered with the Garden Club of America, and the Garden Club of America is working on this with all of our 200 clubs across the country and 18,000 members. So that's really exciting, and it's, yeah.
I was wondering, how much does our water system filter?
Filter the chemicals.
Chemicals.
In terms of, if
For
you
drinking
measure
water.
it, is it there? Yes. Do I have quantities in any specific one? No. But water treatment anywhere does not take it out. So I don't know where you live, where you get your water source. In town of Bedford, we have 2 now. When I started doing this, everybody was on well water, so what we put in our yards literally went directly into our water. But now the hamlets of Bedford and Hills and Katona also get water from the Croton Reservoir, and there it depends on how people in our watershed, which then becomes the Catskills, take care of their yards and gardens. That's why my organization is a national organization, and it means everybody needs to behave this way.
And likewise, do Brita filters and those kind of things ever,
They don't take it out in any significant manner.
Most of the
Water
filtration's
treatment.
designed to get biological material, bacteria and
Well,
particles out, but the chemicals that are water soluble, they're not filtering.
They can be filtered individually by charcoal filters that take out specific chemicals. But charcoal filters, the way a Brita filter, any charcoal filter works, it's got pores, and the pores trap things. So if something's too big or too small, it goes right through. Too big doesn't go in. When it's filled up, it doesn't go in. So it's not an effective way of dealing with this. But even when you have really great water treatment, at major cities, it goes through. This water treatment will not remove these chemicals or the drugs that people flush down the toilet. You literally have to not put them in, and it's really easy to do that. So, yeah.
So what do you drink?
I drink my tap water. I live in town of Bedford, in Katona. We have well water, and we have, the biggest sources of pollution of well water in the Westchester area and certainly Bedford are MBTE from gasoline, if you live near a couple of gas stations that had plumes, and dry cleaning fluid, TCE or perf, And those things, I know where they are in Bedford. We live literally right near the Cross River Reservoir, so it's pretty protected from anything industrial, and the water is I think as good as, again, you never know, but as good as anything you can find. And I work with my neighborhood to try and decrease how everybody, uses these chemicals, to either not use them or barely use them.
Is water in the reservoir that comes from rainfall generally better then because there's less runoff?
No, groundwater is usually cleaner because it's filtered. And runoff goes straight into surface water. So surface water is more vulnerable.
Yes.
But and it's also more vulnerable to growing through green algae for the same reasons.
Yes.
So surface water is much more vulnerable. Those of us in towns like ours, where your water serves a dual purpose, both to drink on, for most of the people in town, plus to serve New York City's reservoir, have to be really careful with how you treat things.
One thing we should add to that though is a lot of these native plants filter water. So and the things that fix nitrogen, like Baptisia and Comptonia, they actually fix nitrogen in the soil, but the deep roots of a lot of native plants act as water filtration systems so that the rainwater that's going deeper is going through their roots, and they actually pull out some toxins, which is...
Well, they also, what they do is they filter it and then they allow it to be absorbed into the deep water aquifers, rather than run off into the surface water where it carries top of the water pollution into it.
Right,
and
good.
Trees are really the best. And the other big thing with trees for all of us now is two things. One is they absorb carbon, so do a lot of these plants. So does the soil. The soil absorbs a lot of carbon if you treat it right. It's a huge carbon sink. But the trees are too, and trees in more residential areas, suburban areas, also decrease the amount of air conditioning needed.
I'm puzzled. Just thinking about the botanical gardens in Wave Hill. Do they consider native plants a crucial aspect of their plantings, or do they plant anything?
Really good question. Both of those places, well, especially New York Botanical Gardens, started off sort of like a zoo. They were collectors. So they were showing plants from all different parts of the world. And I forget when it was open, maybe 7 years ago, they have a magnificent native plant garden
More than
that was designed by Ullman van Sweden that has a beautiful water feature there. And I walked through there about once a month to see what's what and get ideas for plant combinations, all of native plants, because it's beautifully designed, it's beautifully curated. Now their rule is they're not strictly native in that a plant doesn't have to be native to the Bronx. In order to qualify, but native to a larger region, which is the rule I follow as well. I plant some stuff that, is technically a little farther west or a little farther south than our region, and I think that's okay because they're pretty garden plants and they're not going to become invasive because they have controls here. So I feel that's okay. Pure species, open pollinated, non-cultivars are the best thing you can plant for the environment. But we all allow ourselves a little variation for color or height, zone a little bit.
What about Wave Hill?
Wave Hill is, I think by and large, a
horticultural center.
What?
It's a horticultural
center.
So they will have many different things.
Yes, it's sort of a collection, and they're developing and monitoring plant species, and it's beautiful. The other place I've been involved is Untermeyer, right down the road. Untermeyer is a historic garden, and so when I first interacted with Untermeyer, I thought I had actually zero interest in Untermeyer because I'm a native plant person, and I sort of see historic gardens as where all the problems started because people were bringing plants from all over the world and trying to make something that was not in everybody's experience, So they're exotic plants by definition. So I had very little interest until I had a conversation with Steve Brooms, the executive director there, and he said, we're thinking about doing a meadow between the big staircase that goes down to the river and the river on that side. And I said, no. So I've been working with them. In fact, we gave a presentation 5 or 6 weeks ago with some other people who are meadow specialists about how they might best approach that. because the whole thing is covered with Japanese knotweed and mugwort. So what do you do to first control that stuff before you start trying to plant native stuff? So it's a huge challenge. But I think of that area right along the flyway of one of America's greatest rivers being a native meadow. It makes my heart go pitter-pat.
I have a question. What symptoms should one look for if the water is contaminated in some way?
I don't think it's, again, these things increase the incidence. It's not that I can tell you what symptoms to look for a specific contaminant. You can look, if you get your water from a well or you get it from a municipal water supply.
Municipal water supply.
You can find out from your town or look online at that water supply and get detailed testing of everything that is in that.
You're
So
required to send that out.
bottled water has many more contaminants than tap water does. The requirements for testing are much lower, and the requirements for what's considered allowed are much lower. The plastic that I wrote about in my book, plus the plastic, both in the water and in the environment. But if you look on, but there are issues with water and with PFAS throughout, now that we know about that throughout the country, but look at your municipal water and see how it tested, or speak to someone in your town. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm currently pulling out less of celandine, greater celandine.
Yeah,
Good luck.
the wrong celadine.
Yeah, they're all celandine. And so much of it. Every year, we actually covered it up a couple of years ago. We did something last year, and this year we went whole hog, 2 hours every few days. We have guys coming in, they're doing it, pulling it out. Originally, they said, well, we could use chemicals. No. We're pulling it out. So they're really close, and now I have all this dirt, pathways, yes. Little pathways through my various gardens. And what you suggest I could put there, because it would probably be grass, some grass-like walking, surface.
Do you wanna
is this
walk
to
on it?
walk on
I
it?
wanna walk on it, yeah, because I have a bed here and a bed there.
Yeah, a strip of grass just to walk on it
It's fine.
is fine.
Just
And
regular.
I have, lawn to walk on. The best use of grass really is as paths between garden beds.
I mean,
There are some plants that, say will take some foot traffic, creeping thyme and stuff like that, but they're not native either. So I wouldn't fight with,
Yeah, there isn't a native,
yeah.
There's not a really good native, I don't think, that you're gonna, a lot of these prairie plants, when they grow in, you can walk over them because they just regenerate from the prairie that's next to them. But that's not, in a small yard, that's not what you're going to see. So yeah, it's easier if you have a grass that you're cutting. Add some clover if you want.
Clover's great. You can get grass seed mixes that include clover, and that has a lot of wildlife value, so.
Yeah, and that would like right into the flower beds.
It can, yeah,
Yeah.
even Dutch white clover, which is the least aggressive of all of them, it can, but it's really easy. If you use Dutch white clover, it's really easy to weed out. I use it, a lot of farmers use it on vegetable gardens as cover crop because it's so easy to remove and it fixes nitrogen. So mine is invasive. It comes up in my vegetable garden every year and I don't have to weed it. It's a back and forth. I only have so much time. My time is more spent with my native gardens and my family. So to have that growing through my vegetable garden is like, in my mind, sort of a bonus.